Good afternoon, readers. It's Tilly here from Tilly Shelf, and I'm here for some kind of unscheduled extra video that you would never expect there to be. It's not a Thursday, but it is a Tuesday, and it's Tag Tuesday, and I have been watching recently a lot of the versions of the spoiler tag that was created by Scott and Nell over at Gunpowder I've tried this 3 times now, and I just can't get it out right. Gunpowder Fiction and Plot. Don't know why that's such a tongue twister, but somehow it is. And yeah, I've seen a lot of nice versions, and I don't think I've got anything particularly interesting or original to say, but I just wanted to join in the discussion. So spoiler warnings for this video, because there's a range of books that I've got out in front of me, and I might accidentally start talking about spoilers from them. But as yet, I can't really tell you which books they might be for. Spoiler warning also, if you haven't seen Scott and Nell's video, if they sadly spoiled the ending of Moby Dick for me. Which I somehow didn't know that much about Moby Dick. No, I'm joking. I don't think it would actually massively affect my reading experience. But yeah, just a little joke there. And I guess it kind of illustrates how hard it is to avoid spoilers sometimes if you're actually going to talk about things and talk about books and ideas, because they are just kind of wrapped up in the things that we are just generally inclined to talk about. So let's start getting down to the questions. I should say nobody's tagged me in this, I don't believe. I mean, if you have, let me know, because obviously that means that I have somehow not watched your version of the tag, and I should go and check it out. I don't get tagged because I don't do tags, but sometimes I like to do tags. But in response, I'm not going to tag on, because the thing that often stops me from doing tags is I find it quite stressful trying to work out who to tag and who hasn't done the tag yet and things like that, and it just adds to my head friction on the topic of making videos, and it just puts me off, which is a shame because I really like the community aspect of tagging. But anyway, this is a ramble. Let's get on to the questions. Question number 1 is, what do you consider a spoiler? And to me is something that is going to negatively affect normally your enjoyment of a book by knowing it before reading it, and it would normally be something that would relate to the plot. I think it's very difficult to spoil something that is not related to the plot. I guess you could talk about kind of aspects of the writing style or the emotions involved, but generally those wouldn't have the same spoiling effect. There is a lot of discretion over what kind of a plot point would act as a spoiler. I think Nell said it, and it's something that I agree with. You don't, only you can tell what's going to be a spoiler for you, and you can normally only tell it once you've read the book. And I think Scott also talked about something that he thought was a spoiler that turned out not to be a spoiler and things like that. So sometimes you just have to read the book to find out how much of a spoiler that thing was. So in a sense, it shouldn't really affect whether or not you read a book, but it's something that might make you reconsider reading a book, or generally impact on your enjoyment of that reading experience. There's a lot of discretion involved, like I said, and there's a very fine distinction between information about the plot that will kind of whet your appetite and get you interested and engaged in a book and get you thinking, oh, I want to see how that pans out, and something that will actually push you too far and make you think, that's not for me. But sometimes a spoiler can be useful, because sometimes finding out something that you think, that's not for me, can help you to rule out books that you don't want to read. So yeah, it's difficult. I would say spoilers become more important when they are about things that we care about more. I know there's been so much discussion about spoilers for Game of Thrones. I have never been that into it, but I know when the TV series and things were coming out, people were always saying, don't spoil it for me. When the Harry Potter books were coming out when I was a kid, there was this big thing where somebody strung up a banner across a road with a massive spoiler on it, and it's that thing where it's something that people care about a lot, then they care a lot more about the idea of a spoiler, whereas for any other book series, firstly, people wouldn't bother to do that, and secondly, people just wouldn't care so much about having that information revealed. So, second question. Does the genre that you're reading impact on what you consider to be a spoiler? And definitely yes. So the classic example of a spoiler is the murderer in a murder mystery. It can also be the murdered person. To me, that's a big spoiler. I don't want to know who's being killed until they've been killed, just because it will set up my expectations for a scene differently. If I'm thinking, they're about to be killed, and part of, for me, is part of the mystery is working out who's being killed. It kind of fits into working out who the murderer was as well. There are like different genre approaches to spoilers. For instance, like you might say that it's not possible to spoil non-fiction. I would say I've got 2 books here regarding that, and I think it depends on the kind of non-fiction. Obviously, you can't really spoil a recipe book, which I do happen to have a recipe book on the table. Like telling me what recipes on page 180 of this book is not going to affect my enjoyment of the other recipes in the book. But for instance, Adam Kay's, I don't have his first book, but his first book, This Is Going to Hurt, that is definitely a book that has a spoilerable ending, and one that I always have to resist telling people about the ending, because I think the ending is really well executed, but I don't want to spoil it for people because I want them to have the same impact from that ending that I had. And also I've got The Testament of Youth, which is a memoir from the First World War. A lot of characters die in this, and I was told in advance, or found out in advance, maybe even from the blurb. No, not from the blurb. But yeah, I knew that a character was going to die going into this book that I kind of wish I hadn't known. So I think, yeah, non-fiction can also be spoiled, and a lot of that revolves around, somehow spoilers quite often revolve around death. And I think that's because of the way that we get attached to characters and the way that we interact with characters. Their death is the thing that we can care about most and that we have a lot of emotions tied up in. Obviously, for a romance, for instance, you could spoil who the characters end up with. Particularly, I'm thinking, a lot of romances is pretty obvious, but I'm thinking, like, say for instance, YA romances that quite often depend on a love triangle. You could spoil like which direction the love triangle was going to go in, I suppose. But yeah, generally speaking, that's something that you can predict more easily, so it might be have less of an impact. But yeah, that would be another area that you could consider there being spoilers in, I suppose. Another area in which like the genre that you're reading impacts what you see as a spoiler is, I would say, like how old the book is. I know I've discussed Shakespeare plays with Roz from Scallydandling about the books, and I said something and I was like, oh, we should say spoiler warning for that. And I remember her being like, you can't say a spoiler for this play that's like 400, 500 years old. But if you haven't read that, you might still consider it to be a spoiler. You could argue that most of Shakespeare plays, like, there is plot there, but a lot of it is about like the language and the way it's presented. So it can't really be a spoiler, but that depends on the person and what that person who's receiving that spoiler cares most about in terms of that play, whether they're reading it for the language or whether they are actually reading it because they don't know what happens to Romeo and Juliet in the end. Which could still happen, you know, there could still be people out there who don't know. But, you know, hard to believe at this point. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, like how old a story is, impacts on the view of spoilers, is like the Greek approach to spoilers, or quite a lot of like ancient legends and older stories have this approach to spoilers where spoilers are actually seen as a good thing and seen as a thing that you want to know what story they're going to be telling you. So they will often like, so this is the Iliad, and they will often, but also in the Odyssey, Homer or whoever was constructing these poems would often like very literally tell you what was about to happen, either later in that kind of chapter or verse, or even towards the end of the story, because that was seen to raise the kind of the dramatic tension and raise the power of the scene. And I would say, haven't finished the Iliad, but having read the Odyssey quite recently, it weirdly worked for me. Like at first I found it a little bit irritating, but then I was like actually expecting that to happen, and watching how those threads come together really works in a way. And also, if you knew what story you were going to be hearing and you were actually asking, oh, I want to hear the one about Odysseus, then you would know the answer to that. And a lot of it is about how that story is then being told and how that story is then being brought together. So yes, I think genre does impact on what counts as a spoiler and what matters as a spoiler, definitely. Being a bit long-winded here. So question number 3, all the best bits are in the trailer. Sometimes a synopsis can be too detailed. Do you research books prior to reading? I do, to a certain extent. Like, I listen to people's reviews on BookTube. If I hear something that I consider to be a spoiler, I try very hard to forget it or stop paying attention. It doesn't always work. I tend to say I'm reading about the author, for instance, like quite often on Wikipedia, there'll be a little introductory paragraph and then there'll be a section labeled synopsis. I will always skip the synopsis until I have completely finished the book. And then I'll go back and I might read the synopsis just to see like how they interpret that synopsis, and which plot points they consider to be more important or less important. I would say even skipping the synopsis, you can still have what I think of as like early book spoilers. And these matter to me. I don't think they matter to everybody, but I don't like having things from the first few chapters necessarily spoiled for me because I like to see how things unfold. So at the moment I'm reading a book called Paradise by Abdulrazak Gurna, and I would say in very general terms this is a coming of age story, and it's about a boy who has experiences that are reminiscent of, but not necessarily exactly like, but reminiscent of these sort of experiences in Dante's Inferno kind of journey that he goes on there. But when I read this, and also from the blurb, indeed from the blurb, it tells you quite a lot. It tells you the start of this character's experience and the first things that happen to him that kind of cover like the first third of the book in summary, and that bothered me when I was reading it because I didn't want to know that, and I was constantly thinking, I know that XYZ is going to happen, I'm expecting it in this chapter, or no, like it hasn't happened but I know it's still going to happen. And then like when the author was narratively suggesting that the character had reached a place where a certain thing was going to happen, because I knew from the blurb that a certain other thing was likely to happen, that kind of affected my ability to follow what the author was saying. So I kind of think that authors should write their own blurbs because they know where they want you to be misled and where they don't want you to be misled, and things like that. And I don't think that happened in this specific case. It's a really good book, by the way. I would definitely recommend it. So, question number 4. Sometimes the introduction can spoil the ending, especially with classics. Has this ever happened to you? Yes, definitely. My favourite book to talk about spoilers with, actually, is Anna Karenina by Tolstoy. And yes, I know most people know the ending of this book, whether or not they've read it. But I think my spoilers for this book kind of intensified my relationship with it, and it's been a very long relationship with this book, from first finding out what the ending was to actually reading to the end of the book, which took me, it was probably like a decade over the course of that happening, and I haven't read this for a long time. I should probably reread it, actually. So I first found out the ending of this book by accidentally watching the final 10 minutes of the film without knowing what film it was, and obviously seeing a certain thing happening, not the recent film but a much older film, seeing a certain thing happening, and then I picked up my parents' copy of the book and read a spoiler on the blurb that spoiled that last scene that I'd seen in the film, and I was like, oh, this is the film that I saw that time, that I saw the ending of that time. And then later I picked up the book again, like having forgotten those things, but remembering, oh, there's a spoiler on the blurb, so I shouldn't read the blurb. Started reading the introduction and got a spoiler again from the introduction. And it was just like layer on layer of telling me the ending of this book that I didn't want to know the ending of it before I got to it. But I still loved the book and I still enjoyed the book. As it stands, I would never normally read the introduction to a book before I read it, unless I have some very specific reasons, like I know that it's going to take me a while to read, but I need to have a discussion about it before potentially I might have read the end, or if I feel like I already know enough about where the story is going. Like an example might be a Shakespeare play where I might have seen it performed even if I've not read it, then I would be happy to read the introduction. Question number 5. Name a time somebody spoiled a novel for you. I'm going to go ahead and spoil this one for you if you haven't read it, but I feel like not many of you either haven't read it or are wanting to read it. So this is Mockingjay by from The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. It's the last book in the trilogy, and I read the first 2 books and I hadn't read this one, and I asked my friend, we were sitting together at like the first session in a college day, we were sat next to one another, and I was like, oh, you read it, like how is it? And she was like, spoiler is coming now. Oh yeah, it's not that great. Prim dies and then they have a Hunger Games for the kids in the capital, and I was really upset that she told me those things. Like I had asked her like how was the book, but I was upset to hear that, and it also really, really put me off reading the book, and I was like, that completely undermines the whole point of what the first 2 books were about. That's ridiculous. I don't know why she would do that. Like, why would this happen in the story? It doesn't fit with the world, blah, 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 blah. And like 5 years later, eventually I read this and really quite enjoyed it. I enjoyed the final book. I think just before the film came out, I eventually read it. And the spoiler that she told me wasn't strictly true. Yes, Prim dies, and yes, there's this proposal that they're going to have this final Hunger Games, but it doesn't actually happen, and it definitely doesn't happen in the way that she presented it to me, where I thought that it was going to be the district's idea to do that, if that makes sense. So I guess it's kind of like a cautionary tale with spoilers, is you might think it's a spoiler, but it might not actually be a spoiler in the way that you think, or the way that person has summarised the plot might not actually be your normal response to the plot. So that was my little spoiler experience. So next one, have you ever spoiled a novel for somebody else? Yes, probably unintentionally. I really try quite hard not to, but because spoilers are so kind of personal, like me saying, for instance, what I said earlier on about Adam Kay's book, somebody could say just knowing that there's a dramatic ending to that book is enough of a spoiler, or for instance, I have definitely, particularly talking about classic books, I've definitely said things, for instance, about a couple that gets together in a romance, for instance, and then immediately said, oh, I should have said spoiler warning before that. So although I try and avoid it, I know I sometimes slip up. If I do slip up, I try and put it either in the title of the video or in the first line of the description, just to say spoiler warning. But I would say, like most of my reviews, there is a 50-50 chance that I might slip up and give a slight spoiler. Normally I wouldn't be like saying who the murderer was, but I might be saying like an early book spoiler would be the most likely thing. Or in a classic book, what couple gets together at the end. Question number 7. If spoilers ruin novels, are there some authors or books that you can't reread? Not generally. I'm a very happy rereader. I do a lot of rereading. Particularly, I do reread a lot of murder mysteries. I love rereading Agatha Christie. I brought one out for a different question. This is The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. One of my most common reasons for rereading murder mysteries is I've actually forgotten who the murderer was. So I like to reread to check that I've remembered correctly or find out the ending again. So that's a common reason why I would reread. Also, I reread murder mysteries because I like to see the clues, and I like to see like which clues I identified, which clues I missed, and just like work out how the author built that picture, and whether or not they did a convincing job, and like be able to see the red herrings and stuff. A lot of books, it's more about the style anyway, or it's more about the characters. So having mysteries that you know the answer to doesn't necessarily matter to your enjoyment of the rereading. Generally, the books that I wouldn't necessarily reread are kind of like the ones that are a bit naff anyway. Like, I don't want to be mean to anyone's favourite book if they love it, but I recently read The Girl on the Train. Can't remember the name of the author. Obviously, that is a murder mystery. Obviously, to a certain extent, it does have some twists. But I didn't, like, although the ending wasn't necessarily what I predicted from the beginning, I didn't get enough enjoyment from the process of reading that book that I would ever want to read it again, because actually I found it quite tiresome at times. So really it depends on like the quality of the book and the enjoyment of reading the book more than anything. What I would say is I don't think spoilers ruin stories completely, and I think you can see that from the way that we watch films of our favourite books, and we watch, for instance, live action remakes of, like, everybody who watched, for instance, the live action remake of Cinderella, which was ages ago now, everybody went into that knowing that Cinderella her foot was gonna fit into the slipper at the end, right? Sorry if you didn't. But that doesn't stop us from wanting to watch it, because we want to see the way that the story is told. And sometimes with books as well, we want to see the way that the story impacts on us at a later stage, or the way that the story kind of interacts with with us and the way that we're reading it at that time. So it doesn't necessarily matter what we know about the story, because it's about the journey of the reading is more important. I don't know if that made enough sense. But yeah, I think that's really important to whether or not something is ruined. It's more about the approach and the experience rather than necessarily a key plot point. When reviewing, are you spoiler free, and does this limit your ability to discuss? I definitely try to be spoiler free. but I think that it definitely does limit your ability to discuss. I've took a lot of notes for this one in really tiny handwriting, so I'm just trying to read them and talk at the same time. So for instance, to me, whether the twist in a book was pulled off can really like make or break the story, and it is very hard to analyse that without specifying. So it really limits the scope that you can have for your review. So the book I mentioned briefly earlier on, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, that has definitely got a very big twist to it. Like most murder mysteries, you don't necessarily know who the murderer is going to be. And I was so tempted reviewing this book to reveal the murderer just so that I can talk about the effectiveness with which that twist is delivered. But I really, really tried not to. But because of that, I felt like my review didn't really get into the nitty-gritty of this book and didn't unpick the structure of the book and the narrative voice and the telling of this book in the way that I wanted it to. So I felt like my review was very limited by that. Nell and Scott mentioned kind of that scene in Jude the Obscure, which I've got here. And yeah, they just said, it's that scene, and if you know Jude, you know what it is. I wanted to talk about that scene because to me, like, I finished that book while I was in Lebanon, so I haven't actually reviewed it on this channel at all anyway, but like, I would want to talk about that scene because to me, that scene kind of disconnected me from the book, and I didn't like the way that that scene was delivered. I actually found it a very much, my suspension of disbelief was lost at that stage. So I wanted to talk about like why that was and how that works, but at the same time, it's such a significant scene that you would want to talk about it in a group where you know that everyone's read the book. And I guess that's the benefit of having a book group where everyone's reading the same book, or being in like a class discussion of a book, or what do you call it, like a group read along on BookTube, is being able to discuss those twists. I know that some people do like a spoiler-free review and then a spoiler review, but to me that's just like too much of an extra level of work to do. And I think also thematically it's quite hard because sometimes you can be talking about one aspect of a story, and then because you're trying to do it spoiler free, and then if you were going to do the spoiler bit, you'd have to come back to that theme, and it would just be more and more convoluted, a bit like this video has turned out to be. Other spoiler related things that I was going to mention. There are other ways that things can be spoiled other than by people telling you the ending, and one of those is by history, with historical novels. Just wanted to hold up the mirror and the light. Just because, like, throughout this series, which is based in Tudor history, there have been certain spoilers, like certain characters that you know are going to die at certain times. And obviously, if you don't know Tudor history, then that's fine for you. For me, one of the big things that makes me dread finishing this book, and I still haven't finished it or picked it up again since nearly this time last year, or like a month after it first came out, is knowing what's going to happen at the ending and really, really not wanting that to happen, and like having this real, like, and again, it's to do with like people dying and characters that we care about and stuff, having this really strong emotional reaction to not wanting to see that done. Also the fact that it's absolutely massive and, you know, quite dedicated reading. But yeah, like having that ending spoiled by history in a way is affecting my enjoyment of the book itself. A book that I didn't have spoiled for me, miraculously, was Jane Eyre. And I mentioned it in the comment on her video, but I just wanted to say it here too, that I'm very impressed with my mum for not spoiling this, because I came to her halfway through the book, spoilers for Jane Eyre, and when I was like, you know, 12, 13, reading it for the first time, and I was like, I really don't understand, like, they're getting married tomorrow, but there's still half of the book left, and somehow she managed not to tell me anything about the rest of the book. She just like kind of, I don't remember what she said, but she basically like smiled and changed the subject, and then I read the next chapter and I was like, wow, not all 19th century novels have a Jane Austen style ending. It was just mind-blowingly wonderful. So I really appreciate that she didn't spoil that for me. So yeah, I would be interested to see more versions of this tag. I definitely will be checking them out as they come out. I hope this has been interesting and enjoyable for you. Thank you to Scott and Nell for creating the tag. Like I said at the beginning, I'm not specifically tagging anyone, but I would love to see more versions. So if you do make a version, just let me know and I will happily watch it. And if you don't make videos, but you do have thoughts on spoilers, I would love to hear what you think of them in the comments down below. Okay, take care.